5TQX. Welcome to Outdoor Wonder.
Hey, this is Jake Taylor, your host of the world's first interview Hikecast. We dive deep as interesting people take me on their favorite hikes. So if you're ready for something a little different, throw this on, get outside, and come take a hike with us. Today we're going for a hike with Chris Kelly, the founder of Nourish Balance Thrive. Chris is a computer scientist and pro cyclist who turned his considerable brain power toward hacking the human body. Chris and his team are out on the cutting edge of science to help athletes maximize their potential. I hope you enjoy this hike with Chris Kelly. But first, please save a spot on your shelf for my first book coming out later this year. It's called The Rebel Allocator, and it's a fictional coming-of-age story about a young man who learns about business and life from an unlikely teacher. Imagine Thorndike's The Outsiders meets The Karate Kid. You're probably saying to yourself, fiction? Really, Jake? My goal was to give you everything you'd learn from a good nonfiction book, but wrap it in an entertaining story. Look for it to come out later this year. And now, without further delay, let's get outside. It's kind of an interesting path how you've ended up where you are now.
Yeah.
You know, you started out doing computer science and got hired on by Yahoo. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I graduated in 2000 and then ended up working in London for Yahoo. And it was kind of an interesting little side venture they had going. It was a startup within Yahoo. And I think one of the senior executives said, I quite fancy spending a couple of years in London.
Yeah.
And so he came over to London, but that didn't work out. And then all these people they'd hired in London, they said, I'm really sorry, but this thing's going away. But you've got the option to go and
come back to the mothership.
Yeah, come back to the mothership. And I thought, I really like snowboarding and riding my bike, and that sounds like a lot of fun. So I said, okay, I'll go live in Sunnyvale. That sounds sunny.
Yeah. So then did they brought you over, no problem, like visa and everything was all?
Yeah, so that was I really owe a lot to Yahoo, actually. They literally, movers came to my house and took everything.
Yeah.
Put it in boxes, like even stuff that shouldn't have gone. And they sorted out my visa, and it was, and they got a place for me when I arrived, and I didn't have to do anything. It was brilliant. They were really good to me.
Well, that was a pretty fortunate to have that during that time period too, because they were, that was the tech crash, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it was like everything was crashing down, 2001 or something. That's probably part of why the startup in London didn't work out right.
Yeah. So then what was the next step after that? Was that to the hedge fund, or were there other things in between?
No, yes, I worked for Yahoo for about a year. And I can remember them saying to me, look, you can't live in San Francisco and commute to Sunnyvale every day because you're going to get bored of the commute. It's like too long. And one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to leave or you're going to have to move closer.
Yeah.
And in the end, I decided to leave because it really does suck. Anyone that's ever done the commute from San Francisco down 101 to Sunnyvale, it really sucks.
Yeah, and that was before they would do like buses and all these other things.
Yeah, it's probably better now, isn't it? I got a job in San Francisco with Amazon, but it wasn't Amazon.com proper, because at that time they weren't allowed to have Amazon in California because of the sales tax thing, right? So it was Alexa Internet, and they did internet search and like statistics. They used to have this. Do you remember that? They used to have a toolbar that sat inside your web browser and tracked you wherever you went, so they knew which were the most popular sites. It's kind of an interesting project.
I remember the Alexa rankings.
Yeah, that's how they got it.
Yeah.
It was a toolbar that ran in Internet Explorer.
Huh.
It's a kind of a search engine type company. And then that was great, working in the Presidio. I got to ride my bike a lot. I think I learned to kiteboard around that time. And it was right by Crissy Field, so I could go kiteboarding at lunchtime almost, which was great.
Wow. So then what came after that? What'd you go to?
So that got boring. And then one of my friends, actually, a long-standing friend that I met kiteboarding, he was in finance, and he said, there's this new hedge fund startup that you might be interested in. They're looking for people. And it was in the Ferry building in San Francisco, right on the end of Market Street.
Yeah.
Fantastic location. They've got a
Yeah, the farmer's market there.
yeah,
It's
that's right.
unbelievable.
Farmers market there is great. And I would describe the building as a hedge fund hotel. You know, it's this glass building at the end of Market Street, and most of the funds in there are really small, and they need a little bit of support. You know, they need all the stuff that you need when you're trading, and so the ferry building provides that. And that was a really exciting time actually, because all the people I was working with were really, really smart people, a group of PhD mathematicians, mostly from Princeton. And you know, I think it took me a long time to figure it out. There's all these investors, you know, they would come and do their due diligence, and they would meet the guys. And I think what they were thinking was, oh, I can see that you're smart. The question is, can you turn the lights on, right?
Yeah.
And so they built a model, and it did work, but I don't really know what happened in the end. The fund definitely doesn't exist anymore. Yeah.
Well, it can be a difficult game to play for sure.
Yeah, and I think it was like, you know, it's it works in theory, but then in practice things go wrong, you know.
Right. Well, sometimes if it's not the right time for that particular strategy,
yeah,
and you don't catch the wave right out of the gates,
yeah,
maybe it would have worked 2 years from then or 2 years ago.
yeah.
There's definitely a lot of luck involved.
I think it was things like, you know, slippage. You think that you're going to get one price, and then the actual price the model settles at is totally different from what you thought you were going to get.
Yeah.
And then all the corporate actions were a nightmare with equities. The corporate actions, you know, like you think you bought one thing, and then you come into work the next day, and oh, now you've got these two other things.
Yeah.
Like, go figure that out. So that was challenging for them. But
how about for you personally in that time period? What was what were you doing there that you felt like you were growing? And I mean, were you working on machine learning already by then?
No. So that was the thing was, you know, I've worked with companies that surely have been using machine learning as part of their core offering for decades, and never really understood it or got close to it. And
probably wasn't called that either by anybody.
Maybe not. That's probably right. Yeah. And I was like the plumber, you know, like I was the guy that would hook the model up to the market so they could do something interesting. So yeah, it was only much later that I got into learning machine learning.
So you did the hedge fund thing for a number of years, and then I assume that health came next.
Right.
Is that right?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question in itself, because, you know, definitely things came to a head in 2012, 11 or 12. But I mean, you realise with hindsight, 2020 hindsight, that, you know, this is not new, right? Like, you probably made some terrible decisions even as a child. And you know, I wish my mum knew some of the things that we know now, because it could have saved me so much suffering. You know, things like I was weaned onto formula milk at 4 months.
Yeah.
Maybe even younger than that, actually, I think. And, you know, just had a terrible diet as a child, just consisting entirely of refined carbohydrates and margarine and skim milk and all this terrible stuff I wouldn't touch now.
Low-fat propaganda at that time.
Yeah, my parents really bought into it, and then I guess I did too. And so, yeah, when did it start? I don't know, probably before I was born, right? My mum probably wasn't that in great health before I was born.
Yeah, your grandparents probably had a healthier diet.
Yeah, it's true. So, yeah, I mean, even when I was at Yahoo, I noticed that things were getting worse. I put on a lot of weight as soon as I arrived in America.
Probably portion sizing is a
portion
problem.
sizing, and then with some things that I had never seen before. They were just so tasty, like cookies. These giant, you know, cookies like half the size of a dinner plate.
Oh yeah.
And you leave them on a paper towel and they leave a greasy mark, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I didn't really know. Put on a lot of weight. I started getting a lot of fatigue, was like kind of the main complaint. And then GI symptoms, a lot of gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation.
And And did you feel like it was just like, well, that's just kind of part of getting older?
Yeah. No, not really. I think I knew from the beginning that something was off. But I literally had no clue how to tackle it. The weight loss thing was kind of interesting. So Jeremy Zaldany, who is the creator of MySQL, I understand, or one of the early MySQL guys, and he worked for Yahoo at that time. And he also became quite overweight working for Yahoo. And I remember, the one thing I remember about him was that he figured out straight away that the counting calories thing was complete bullshit. Because it didn't make any sense, right? I mean, you only have to be off by an apple a day or something. And after 20 years, you're like 300 pounds overweight. Like,
yeah, and I think,
I'm making those numbers up, but it's something like that.
Yeah, I think everybody, I think that's been the experience of a lot of people is like they add a couple pounds a year.
Right.
They feel like they're doing everything right. And now, like, what happened?
Right. So yeah, when did I first go to the doctor? It was pretty much later than that. It was when I was working for the second hedge fund. So the first hedge fund collapsed. I got a job with another one in Walnut Creek, California. And those guys were great. Really easygoing. And it was fun work. Still not doing anything particularly technically challenging, so I got a bit bored.
Yeah.
But that was where I first went to the doctor and, just complained of those symptoms. Just went to a primary care doctor and said, hey, look, I'm tired, I'm bloated. Actually, the thing that really made me go the first time was I'd been dating a girl in San Francisco, and I kind of had a long string of failed, you do a few dates and that's it.
Yeah.
But this one girl I really liked, and she was actually a data scientist and a mountain biker, and I was really into it. And I couldn't get an erection. I was like, and she kicked me off of her doorstep one night saying, look, you need to go and see a doctor and then maybe come back when you fixed it. Oh, like, oh shit, but she's right. So that was kind of, we joke now that men only go and see the doctor for one or two reasons. One, your dick doesn't work, or two, you've got a pain in your chest. And for me, it was the former.
Yeah.
So, that's why I originally went to the doctor. And the doctor, you get a sense of, I spent a lot of time at Amazon interviewing engineers, and you start to get a sense of, who's good and who's not that great.
Yeah.
And I immediately got a sense with the doctor that
this wasn't going to be the...
No. So, as an engineer, you're always thinking, like when you're tackling a problem, like, well, what happened? What's the cause of this?
Right.
Like this was working last week, now it's not working. So, what went wrong? And so this doctor, he didn't make any attempt to try and understand what was causing my problems. He just jumped straight into solutions.
Right.
And in my experience, that's almost a terrible mistake, So, my best analogy is I like to ride bikes, and sometimes I get a flat tire, and if I just go in and shove in a new tube before understanding why the first one went flat,
it's going to go flat again.
It's going to go flat again. So you have to understand what caused the problem before you jump to the remediation stage. But this doctor said, oh yeah, here's some Viagra. That'll fix your erectile dysfunction, assuming the problem's not in your head. So that can happen. Like if there's something going on in the brain with a singling, then Viagra fixes a plumbing problem. And if there's no signal coming from the brain, then
it's not going to matter.
It's not going to, no amount of fixing the plumbing is going to help. But with me, it's just literally plumbing. So, I know now that I probably had really terrible endothelial health. So the lining of my arteries and probably elsewhere too was not in good shape. So yeah, Viagra did work. And he said, oh, well, because you've got some GI symptoms, you should go and see a gastroenterologist.
Did they even test your testosterone or anything at that point?
He didn't, no.
How could you not do that at a minimum?
I don't know. They didn't. I had really good health insurance. I had PPO health insurance, and the hedge fund were really proud of it. And I went to Sutter, and they didn't. I didn't know. I didn't really know. I probably didn't even know what it would mean to measure testosterone at that time. He did do some blood testing, and I look at that now, and it was just a really basic, not even a complete CBC, which is a really basic blood test.
Yeah.
So yeah, I went home with my Viagra, and it works. It really works. Like, I like to moan about the drugs a lot because a lot of them don't work, but this one really works. And I went to see the gastroenterologist, and the gastroenterologist said, "Oh well, it's nothing to do with your diet. Yeah, we can do some testing to confirm what you already just told us. Like we put a scope in both ends,
Yeah.
and observe damage, which we already know is there because you've told us about the symptoms, right?
Yeah.
And then what have we got? We've got steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, and then when those stop working, and they will stop working, we've got surgery." And I was like, "Oh, that's a bit disappointing." But it's kind of a weird time where I kind of knew something was off because, like I said, they weren't investigating root causes. But at the same time, I was kind of foggy and not really making great decisions either.
Right.
And so I just sort of went with it. But luckily, I'd met another woman, just been on another OkCupid first date, and met this woman who had just finished her master's degree in food science and had been studying food allergies in the lab. And she said, "You should probably try," it's just like kind of off the cuff thing. "Oh, you should probably try an elimination diet before you go for the steroid anti-inflammatories."
Yeah, or surgery.
Or surgery, right? But yeah, so back at that time, it was very much, I was still enamored. You might call it a paternalistic model of healthcare, right? Where you look at the doctor's wearing a white coat and he sees this senior figure, not necessarily male, but this kind of, you do what the doctor says, right?
Yeah, you don't question authority.
You don't question it. And so, yeah, but it was obvious that what my wife, now wife, right, I'm married to this woman now, was suggesting was, it's a zero risk intervention, right? Like it can't really do any harm, and it's not really like time is of the essence here. So I tried the elimination diet, and that was the autoimmune paleo protocol, and it worked spectacularly well. So, a couple of things I do remember measuring in blood was C-reactive protein, and that went from, I think it was like 7 or 8 or 9 milligrams per deciliter, which is really high. So we like to see it.
A lot of inflammation.
Yeah, a lot of inflammation, exactly. It's an acute phase reactant, so it goes up when there's inflammation. And it dropped right down to below 1 within 6 or 7 weeks, I think, of doing the diet, which was fantastic. And that really helped me as an engineer, like seeing, like, okay, I kind of know what this thing is, this blood marker, and I've made a change. And it wasn't easy, but, it's obviously working. And at that point, I had like so much reduction in my symptoms that I started, you can't help but wonder, like, oh, Jesus Christ, I didn't realize, symptoms, you only realize how bad they are once they're gone.
Yeah. It always seems like you don't know you need glasses until you take the eye test.
Yeah, exactly.
Put glasses on and you're like, oh my God, I couldn't see before.
Yeah, I remember that as a child, actually, the first time I wore glasses, thinking, oh my God, I've been walking around, I couldn't see. And then I had the same experience when I had laser eye surgery done in San Francisco. And the thing that's crazy about it is you wake up the next morning and you can see perfectly and you've not got your contact lenses in. You're like, oh, wow, this is the best thing in the whole world ever. And then the next day you don't think about it ever again, right?
Yeah, you just assume that it's
the new norm.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's definitely a moment, and that's we've worked with over 1,500 clients now, I think, and it's very, like, everyone's like, okay, the reason I'm here is because I've already made some progress by myself. I'm wondering what else is left on the table for me. So that's how I got into more of the advanced stuff, more advanced testing and supplements and all the other lifestyle factors. But podcast was a huge part of what recovered my health. When I came to the US, I was a huge fan of the BBC World Service, and it was a bit like a babysitter, really. Kind of the lonely expat living in America, and you just listen to the World Service over and over again. And then the BBC started releasing some podcasts, and that kind of got me into, I don't know whether it was iTunes. I don't think it was iTunes at that point. I don't think I had an Apple device at that point, but that kind of got me into the podcast world. And then I started discovering all these other podcasts. In particular, once I was doing the paleo diet, I discovered Rob Wolf. Yeah. I discovered Lauren Cordain, obviously. Joe Friel authored a book with Lauren Cordain called The Paleo Diet for Athletes, and I read that and was like, well, this is a book for me, isn't it? And I think if I was to read that book again now, I probably think that maybe there was a few, like, he was really big on carbs then. He was like, you need to eat a lot of white rice. Huh. And I'm not. And that was a huge part of it. I realized that I was on the edge of type 2 diabetes. So my fasting blood glucose was 120 milligrams per deciliter. And that's pre-diabetic for sure, if not type 2 diabetic. And changing my diet to include less carbohydrate and more fat. But of course, like we'd already talked about, I was fearful of fat growing up. It was that thing. I actually saw it. There's a movie called Statin Nation, and they showed this clip that they used to run on TV of a woman pouring the contents of it, like a chip pan or something that's got bacon grease in it. I don't know what fat it was, but they said it was saturated fat, and she poured it down the drain and it clogged up the pipes, right? And then they actually took the U-bend out and like showed it to the camera so you could see how the fat was clogging up the pipe. Like that has any relation to what happens in normal human physiology. That's absolutely nothing to do with it. It's not even a like remotely correct model. But yeah, that's what I grew up believing, and so I was eating a lot of carbs. My typical day of eating for me would be cereal for breakfast, sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, and then I used to have to get up in the middle of the night to eat. I would get up at like 2 o'clock in the morning and eat another bowl of cereal just so that I could make it through the night.
Yeah.
It seems unthinkable to be me now. And it was like the norm at the time, and people used to make fun of me. We'd go snowboarding at Tahoe in a shared ski house, and I would be like that guy making a load of noise in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and people were like, what the fuck is that guy doing? But yeah, now I don't even think about that.
Well, my blood sugar crashed, and I need to get through the night.
Exactly, my blood sugar crashed, and then I'd wake up in the middle of the night in a poof of cortisol and growth hormone and adrenaline, and then of course you can't get back to sleep unless you eat something. And I think it was probably the hypoglycemic hump, like that rapid, that would like send me back to sleep for a few hours. Yeah, really awful.
When did Nourish Balance Thrive come into the picture then? Because one thing I really respect about you is that it seems like you've been self-taught on a lot of this things.
Yeah.
And just been curious and just followed your curiosity until you got to a point where now become a recognized expert in a lot of these things. How did that go? Like, what was your thought process at the time? Were you just following your curiosity and then
definitely.
It turned into like, well, this is what I want to do now?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And this is it's a very common thread now with our clients is, you just start getting into it. You start reading more papers, listening to more blogs, reading more articles, and really getting into it. And then, I started the podcast, and that was awesome. And guest appearances on podcasts were brilliant, and brilliant people would just find me. And in particular, so Tommy Wood, I think of him as the architect of our program. He's a very traditionally trained MD, PhD. So on the face of it, I remember I was on the Rob Wolf podcast and he booked a free consultation. That was the kind of call to action, come book a free consultation, and maybe we can see about working together. And Tommy booked one of these free consultations, and it was this MD after his name, and I was like, why does this guy want to talk to me? Is he going to tell me to stop it or something?
Yeah.
And he didn't. He was really curious about what had happened to me. He wanted to ask me some more questions. He's also a British guy. He got his undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Cambridge, and then graduated as a medical doctor from Oxford, and then went on to do a PhD in Norway. And it was this super nice guy, and he kept sending me all these papers. Like every day there'd be another 6 papers to read from Tommy, and then eventually, and at that time, sometimes you have to. I love this idea of in education the whole game, right? Like, when you're teaching a kid how to play baseball, and I have to admit, it's just this what they talk about with the whole game. It's a Harvard thing apparently. Is the first thing you do is you throw the ball at the kid and try and get them to hit the ball. And then once they understand the basics and they're having fun with it, then you can get into some of the details. And for some people, they'll never need to know the physics of a curveball in order to be really good with baseball. And so that's how I did it. Was I saw the whole game, saw what it could do for my health. Started MBT, was working with clients, saw what it did for their health, and at that time it was mostly the dietary intervention. Like, people come to us and we just stick them on the paleo diet or AIP maybe, and they would get similar results to me. But eventually you realise that you can't read these papers that Tommy's sending me, and so you have to go back to basics. And it was kind of a difficult decision, where you go like, okay, well, let's go one level down and read that, and you're like, no, I still don't understand it. And then eventually I found myself doing Khan Academy, very basic, organic chemistry, and that was so worthwhile though. And I really enjoyed the organic chemistry once I knew that it was like going someplace I was already interested. Yeah, exactly. So it's this idea of, in education, it was like an important lesson for me. Now I've got kids. It's like, start with the whole game, and then like worry about the details later. A top-down approach, you might call that.
Yeah.
And so Tommy came along, sent me all these papers, and then eventually I said, look, Tommy, would you just come and work with me? Because that would be really helpful, because you obviously know a lot about this health and fitness stuff. And Tommy had been around forever. Not forever, he's quite young. But he'd been around a long time in health and fitness, and he'd seen a lot of stuff. He was much more experienced than he let on in the beginning, like outside of the tradition. Because doctors don't get any training in nutrition, right?
Right.
So he was entirely
They get
self-taught.
like a half a day or something of
Exactly.
in most programs.
Yeah, so he was entirely self-taught. And his mum, he's like one of these lucky people where his mum was kind of a hippie. His entire family have all got a PhD. So his mum, he'd never, his mum had always looked after him and taught him about nutrition. Yeah, I mean, we got to the point where I was like, you know what, I'm just going to see what happens with this. I'll just quit my job at the hedge fund. And I can still remember, I've got a picture of it when I came home from the hedge fund and Ivy was 6 months old. And I said to Julie, oh, I've quit my job and we're going to do MBT full time. And she's just like looking at me.
Yeah. You're kidding me.
We're going to be health coaches. And at that time, Julie was working for, well, actually, no, she quit her job by then, but her last job before she had Ivy was she was working for McKinsey.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, you have a good job, I have a good job. Probably one of us can afford to give up a good job.
Right.
And now both of us have given
Now
up
both
good
of us
jobs.
are
Yeah.
entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Where's the safety net?
Yeah.
How did you get into, because my understanding is that MBT does more, a little bit more of getting the peak performance out of people,
Right.
especially athletes, and not so much just like taking someone who's at a 0 and getting them up to a 2.
Right.
You're taking like 8s and 9s and getting them closer to 10. Why do you think that, is that an accurate assessment first?
Yeah, it is.
And why do you think that that's kind of where the market took you?
Yeah, so I'm forgetting about an important part of the story. Actually, it was why. Part of the reason I wanted to do this was because I was a mountain biker. So I said I was really active, but when I came over to the US, I started getting more and more competitive. I remember one ride I went for. One of my friends said, "Oh, you're really fast. You should come do a race with me this weekend." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, let's do it." And so I did the race and did quite well.
Were you paleo at that point?
No.
Okay.
No, definitely not. And so really got competitive with it and started racing mountain bikes more, got a coach. The coach didn't tell me anything about nutrition. In fact, he gave me the exact opposite advice, which I'm sure works for some people, just was not the right thing for me. Yeah, more and more competitive, got some upgrades, eventually became a Cat 1 mountain biker. And then part of what my goal was to get my pro license. And so, when I went onto those early podcasts, I identified as a mountain biker. I was a budding pro athlete, even though I was way too old to make a career of it. I've never made any money riding my bike, that's for sure. I started mountain biking in my 30s or something. But yeah, so we were, MBT was a thing for athletes. But now more recently, and I'm talking about in the last year, as we've got more people on board, more health coaches, more researchers, those people are not necessarily that excited about helping middle-aged men in Lycra get an extra 1% out at the weekend, right?
Yeah. And not when everyone else around them is struggling with their health.
Yeah. So, what do we do now? I'd say that, we took what we learned helping athletes achieve peak performance and sustained health, and we use similar techniques to help anyone. The main thing, it's kind of like, it reminds me of data science or machine learning, is that you have to have a loss function, right? Like you have to know what success looks like, right? If you don't know what success looks like, and I think that is a real problem. Most people walking down the street today, they don't even know they have a problem, and B, they don't really know what success looks like. And it's really hard to, get people to jump through some fiery hoops and optimize when the person doesn't know what success looks like. The athletes have been, fabulous to us, and they continue to be the core of our business. You shouldn't think that MBT is only for athletes now, that's for sure. And I guess we started branching out by, you have an athlete come to you and you'd fix them, and they would say something like, "Oh, you've got to fix my mum. You've really got to fix my mum. Please fix my mum." And about half of the time, mum would be not interested.
Yeah.
And she would show up and she would do a starter session or something, and it would just be to make the kid happy, and it was just a giant waste of everybody's time. And then at the other half of the time, mum would be, they would also have a loss function, right? So we had one woman in particular that I'll never forget, that she said to us, "All I want to be able to do is mow the lawn and play with the kids in the same day. Can you help me have enough energy to be able to do those two things in the same day?" And I said, "Yeah, of course we can try and do that for you." And we got 6 months later, we get the message back. You never guess what? I've mowed the lawn and played with the kids today. And some of our athletes. So Tommy's working with Formula One drivers. And we've got an Olympic biathlete, and all kinds of other high-end elite athletes. But we're just as excited about the woman mum that mowed the lawn and played with the kids in the same day.
Yeah, that's just as satisfying.
Yeah, and so what we're doing, Tommy has a long history of working with athletes as well. He coached rowers at Cambridge, and the things you do to get the best performance out of an elite rower is exactly the same thing that you do with anyone that's trying to recover their health. It's just that it's just a slightly different optimization function.
Yeah.
So so in the beginning I thought it was all about diet. I thought that all I needed to do was fix my diet, and that would be the end of it. That was all of my problems. And it's true, you can go a long way. If I was to start anywhere, it would almost be with food. It's very hard to help someone that's eating a crappy diet, but it's so much more than that. It's obviously about sleep, prioritizing sleep, and then movement. And with the endurance athletes, that we work with a lot of endurance athletes, and almost none of them are strength training. Yeah. And we know that muscle mass and grip strength are two really important predictors of mortality and health span. So, I mean, not just living longer, but living better years. Right. Like, I'm going to sit on the floor like that, and I'm sitting on the floor. If you can't get up without using your hands, that's not good. That's a test you can do with your parents. Like, that's really not good. They've not got many years to live if they can't do that. And so, how do you hang on to these fast twitch fibers? So the fast twitch fibers are the ones the muscle fibers you're using when you're with maximal strength, like 1 rep max type thing. And the endurance athletes are doing the exact opposite. We're doing, and I still do this now, I still ride my mountain bike a lot, like 10 plus hours a week. But you're engaging in an activity that actively turns fast twitch fibers into slow twitch fibers that go for a very long time, like in your triathlons, right? Right. And so, that's not good. So you've got to counteract that with some strength training. I think it's really important, whether performance is your goal or not. And so strength training is a really important part of our programming now. And we have a really fantastic new head of strength and conditioning. And Tommy has tons of experience there and is more of he definitely doesn't identify as an endurance athlete. He's more of a strength and conditioning guy. And then Zach, who is our new head of strength and conditioning, is Tommy's coach, which I find fabulous, because I don't think there's much that Tommy doesn't know, or at least there's not many people out there that know more than him.
But everybody needs a coach. I mean, that's...
Yeah, it's true. Everybody needs a coach. That's right. And then, other movement, walking, I think is super important. I realised that with hindsight as well, that I just wasn't walking enough. And I was paying the price of that, which was, my back would hurt, my feet would hurt, and I still kind of struggle with that now, because I spend a lot of time sitting.
Yeah. What do you do about computer time?
Yeah. I mean, you've got the Apple Watch on, and I've had good results with that in the past, because it just like buzzes on your wrist every 45 minutes or whatever it is.
At least to stand up, yeah.
Yeah, at least to stand up. Oh my God. Yeah. It's just trying to make these things a habit. That's one of the most powerful things I found. There's a book by Duhigg that maybe you've heard of. Yeah. Charles Duhigg.
Power of Habit.
Power of Habit. Yeah. And so, one of the people that came along and made our program so much better about a year ago, Simon Marshall, and your wife Lindsay has interviewed him for the Primal Endurance podcast, and he's been fantastic. So he turned up. Simon he's a professor of public health. He's a psychologist. He's the performance psychologist for Team BMC, the World Tour cycling team. But he has aspirations beyond athletic performance as well. He's a professor of public health, right? He wants to save the world, just like everybody else. And he came along with all these evidence-based techniques to help people change their behaviour. And I realised, when he first came along, that I had it really easy, because with athletes, you don't really need that many tools to have them change their behaviour. You can just hand them a plan, and they just execute it, no further questions needed. Whereas most people walking down the street, they're not like that. Simon's example that he uses, he talks about himself, is, I know I should drink less, but on the other hand, I really like drinking red wine, like this. And so that's what they call ambivalence, and you need some technique in order to resolve that ambivalence and have the motivation be intrinsic, right? So rather than it being, we talked about that paternalistic model of healthcare where it's the doctor just handing you down, I need you to stop smoking, Mr. Jones. I need you to drink less. I need you to lose some weight. Like, that just doesn't work. Like, people have ambivalence. They're like, yeah, sure, I want to lose weight, but I really like eating chocolate. So you need something to be able to resolve that ambivalence and have the motivation intrinsic and have the person help themselves. And Habits is a really powerful technique. Motivational interviewing is something I'd not heard of before, Simon. That's a powerful technique, and I won't get into the details now, but it's just a method to resolve the ambivalence, right? You look for these things called change words, and you realize, it's like an anti-sell as well. It's probably a different, I bet every used car salesman in the country knows how to do this, right? You say, oh no, this is not really the car for you, and then suddenly you hear these words like, actually, I really want to do this, I think this is what I want. And
I heard an interesting one recently. Where did I hear it from? Oh, I think it was Dan Pink. He said he started using this with his kids, and I've started using it too because I like it a lot. It's this when you let's say the kid doesn't want to do their homework, and you ask them, well, what's on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on not wanting to do your homework?
Right.
And they're like 2. And so then you ask them, okay, now how come you're a 2 and not a 0?
Right.
And like, well, I know that I need to do my
great.
homework to get, if I want to be successful or whatever it is. The reasons why you should be doing it.
Right.
But if you get them to recognize that they're not a 0, they're at least somewhere along, that 2 then can much more easily get up to 6 or 7.
Right. Yeah, and so that's what normally happens when people have unresolved ambivalence. Then they procrastinate, right? They just don't do anything, which may be a good thing. Sometimes I've heard, Nicholas Nassim Taleb talks about that, or procrastination in healthcare can really save you a lot of heartache, right? If the gastroenterologist that was saying, oh, steroid anti-inflammatories in surgery, me procrastinating over that was probably a good thing with hindsight, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, how much things will resolve themselves without some intervention.
Yeah.
How much of medicine has just been reversion to the mean.
Right. I was reading about that this morning, that the placebo effect may not be as important as we thought, and actually a lot of the effects are just regression to the mean.
Yeah.
But there's this really strong desire for us to feel like it was something we did that led to this change.
Right.
Actually, no, it just would have happened anyway had you just stayed out of it. But yes, so Simon's a really deep thinker that has got us thinking really hard about things like that, the placebo effect. There's a really good book called Cure by Joe Marchant that goes into on that. So he's been great teaching us and working directly with clients to help them set goals and change their behavior. And then I was lucky enough, so the podcast has been amazing. At Amazon, I spent literally a whole year trying to hire engineers the conventional way. I had several different recruiters, and they would all pool into one recruiter, and then I'd have a single point of contact. And I spent a whole year and never hired anyone. It was that time Google were just sucking up, and they maybe still are for all I know, just sucking up all of the brains, and it was impossible to hire anyone. And now great people find me through either my podcast or a guest appearance. And Megan was one of those people that came along. She's been coaching with me for over a year now, and super smart woman who had just had part of her master's thesis published in the journal Cell Metabolism. And that's, I hear that paper cited everywhere. We were just talking about it, Peter Attia and Rhonda Patrick.
Their most recent
Yeah,
podcast.
they were talking about it, and they've talked about it on STEM Talk, which is another one of my favorite podcasts. A super smart woman, but not only that, she's a really great coach as well. And another example of where someone who is traditionally trained, right? She's got a master's degree in nutritional biology, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything traditional is evil now, right? We know that, at least I think, that the food pyramid and all of that stuff, that the government guidelines are all completely wrong. But that doesn't mean that everybody that's been traditionally trained is wrong. So that's been great.
So where do you see things going from here?
That's a really good question. I've always been one of those proximal goal type people, I just move from
one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, I just go from one shiny object to the next shiny object. And there's something to be said to that, because if a new shiny object comes along, then I can just jump on it, rather than, I have this 10-year plan and it's all in this document here.
Yeah,
you slam it down on the table and this is what we're doing. But no, so I think, so some of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is how can we automate what we're doing? When Tommy, I've seen him do it. I've been sat there at a table and I've watched him look at a blood chemistry, and he's doing something that, for the most part, he can explain.
Yeah.
What's he doing? Do we really need Tommy to look at everybody's blood chemistry, or can we, turn that into an algorithm of sorts?
Right.
And so, that is it's got me interested in software again, because that's what I've done in the past. I still love working with computers, And so, yeah, that's I think software probably is the future. And I mean, as a business model, exchanging your time for money is not a great business model, right? There's only so many hours in the day you can sell. And then when you've got someone with Tommy with a 15-year education, like, what do? Do you charge $1,000 an hour for his time or something? Like,
yeah.
And then how do you, I mean, you can't justify that. You don't need Tommy to tell you what to eat for breakfast. Like, you know, you really don't need any credentials to tell someone what to eat for breakfast. So then you've got this problem of like, well, what is worthy of Tommy's $1,000 an hour and what's not? It's like, it's a really hard problem. And so, you know, I've been having a lot of fun over the last few years, but definitely not been getting rich doing health coaching, I have to admit. There was one year that I actually made more than my final year at the hedge funds, and that was partly because the hedge fund was not doing well, and partly because we did an online summit, the Keto Summit, and that was great for us. It was really great. Everybody did really well out of that. And so the idea is, I recorded 30 expert interviews in the course of 2 weeks, and then those interviews, they get dripped out over the course of a few days. And most people, they come along and they say, oh yeah, you know what, I can't be bothered to wait for it to drip out. I'm just going to buy the whole thing for $99.
Yeah.
And then we got some friends to help push traffic at it, and that was great. I realised the genius of it was the timing. The people we worked with, like, they'd been done the Atkins diet. So this is a very high-fat, low-carb diet for a very long time, since the 90s. And they knew that if they tried to do the Keto Summit in 2009, everyone would have been gone, keto, what?
Yeah, it's
You're
too
insane.
soon for that.
It's too soon. And so they timed it perfectly. We did it in 2016, I believe. And then, you know, 2 years later, everybody and his wife has got a book and a training course. And that's great. You know, when I ate the keto diet for a couple of years and lost a lot of weight and then gained it all again, made a ton of rookie errors. And you don't have to make those rookie errors now, right? You can go do a training course and not have to make those stupid mistakes. So I think that's great. But yeah, definitely would not be making a lot of money. So, you know, could I, you know, if I create some software that recreates some of what's in my doctors and researchers' heads, or maybe even does some stuff that they're not capable of,
right? Which
is, you know, that is the potential that machine learning offers. Then, you know, could that be a better business model? And my business is, I'd say it's about 70% sweat equity at this point. You know, like Tommy has put in thousands of hours of sweat equity, not gotten any money back for it. And he does get paid a salary now, but yeah, I mean, before then, just so much work for not very much money.
Well, I think a lot of entrepreneurs experience.
Yeah, I was very lucky. I got a golden handshake from the hedge fund, and I did really lucky on the option price at Yahoo. You know, some people were getting an option price that meant that was never going to be worth anything. Money, yeah. And then I walked away from Yahoo with quite a big pile of money. So I was like super happy about that. So, but yeah, you don't really, I mean, I don't know, living on savings for 5 years, like, okay, we really need to make this work this year, you know?
Yeah, no, that can be, especially if it's you by yourself,
yeah,
no problem.
Right.
But when you have family,
yeah,
a wife that
true.
wants some stability and wants to see some.
Yeah, I had this, talk about ambivalence again, like, so I loved Paul Graham's essays and have been following his work for a very long time. And actually his store builder software got bought by Yahoo, I believe. That was the Yahoo store builder was Paul Graham's thing many years ago. And I've been reading his essays about how to start a startup. And he said things like, one person's startup doesn't make, and that was a problem of mine. I didn't know anyone else that I wanted to start a startup with. And I realized I didn't have a very good problem because it was nothing that I wanted for myself. Mm-hmm. And MBT was something I wanted for myself, obviously. So that, it struck that box. But yeah, borrowing money was like another thing. Like, do you really, I mean, so the Y Combinator thing now is like not very much money, right?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more the network that you're in. Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, we've never borrowed any money, at least. I don't owe anyone anything. And yeah, maybe the software will be fruitful at some point. Actually, it's been successful. I tell a lie. It's been successful from the launch. So we launched some software in January of 2018, and it was profitable from the outset.
Is that the blood test?
That's the blood chemistry calculator. And it was profitable from the outset, which is great. And, you know, is it enough to pay everybody's salary? No. But it's enough to pay everyone's mortgage that's involved with it. You know, like, it's a start.
Yeah.
At least we're not losing money. And I certainly didn't borrow any to develop that software, so that's good.
Yeah, I find that to be fascinating. I mean, there's so many markers now that you can get for a reasonable price.
Right.
That if you can feed it into the right algorithm
and
get some actual good information out of it, like, I think I think we're right on the cusp of some way, like, we'll look back at 10 years ago, it was like dark ages.
Yeah, for sure. I think in many regards we'll do that. But yeah, certainly the promise of machine learning is real. It's already happening. So our business, so say an athlete walks in the door, a year ago, we would have spent $2,500, maybe even more, on mass spectrometry to try and figure out what's going on inside of that person. And you'll hear some doctors out there that will like, oh, that's just wasteful. You should work through it systematically. You do a very detailed health history. It's then all about the differential diagnosis.
Get the test that you need.
Exactly.
So they go rule something out.
Exactly. But that's kind of a different market from where we're operating. If you've got an elite athlete and they're just looking for 1%, like even if you can improve their performance by 0.5%, they would be stoked, right? So you're going to leave no stone unturned and do a whole bunch of testing. And so mass spectrometry is this expensive technology that they use to perform many of the tests that we do. So blood testing, urine testing, stool testing. We do a PCR DNA analysis on stool, and then also a traditional stool culture. And quite often we find things that are an infection technically, but they're not so exciting that they're going to like make you bedridden. So C. diff is a bacteria that can become overgrown and cause a lot of problems, and actually kills 14,000 people in the US. But all of those people are probably in hospital, immunocompromised. They're not doing well to begin with. Whereas an elite athlete might be able to do really well. Even we've had some people that were already getting great results in that age group walking around with a C. diff infection. Like, what? Like, some people can die of this, and yet somehow you're still going. And so if you can like lift that weight, it's like that person's running with a weight jacket on and they're still winning, right? Like, okay, let's just take that weight jacket off for you. So it's that kind of investigation. But yeah, the problem is my business looks a lot like kayak.com, where we collect a load of money from the customer and then we just pass it right through to British Airways, who operate the flight. Right, that's like my business. Only I'm taking the money from the customer and I'm just giving it straight to the lab companies that are performing the tests. And so we're not keeping that much of it. And it's annoying because people think our program is really expensive. It's a $10,000 program we do at the moment. And people think, oh, it's really expensive and you're probably getting really rich doing this. Actually, no, we're just giving a lot of money to the lab companies. But it's an all-inclusive program. It includes all the testing, all the supplements, all the coaching, everything. We're not going to send you another invoice once you sign up, typically. We do get some complex cases where we have to, but for the most part, we don't. So the blood chemistry calculator was a way for us to see into the future with these fancy tests, right? Can I do a basic blood chemistry with only 38 markers on, the type that everybody has done at some point in their life? In fact, I hadn't, because my doctor was really quite rubbish. But most people should have done all of these blood markers at some point in their life. And it's a $50 blood test. So let's say you haven't never done one. You can still get one from us. The blood chemistry costs $50, and then we charge some money on top of that for the software report. But it's only a $50 chemistry. And then we feed that into some algorithms, and then the algorithms make predictions, like a forecast, like the weather. It says, oh, there's a 30% chance of rain on Tuesday.
30% chance of C. diff.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so, it's not definitive, but like the weather, it's good enough to where we keep looking at it.
Right.
And you have to be careful because people are not used to this, even though it does exist. So normally when people say, they do a blood test for something, they think, well, this is the definitive answer, isn't it? But actually, no. All tests have a sensitivity and a specificity, is what they call it. Mm-hmm. And so there's a chance that your blood test was just wrong, especially when you get into testing antibodies like that. It's like, forget it. Like, it's really difficult to tell whether or not you've got an infection by looking at IgG antibodies. But all tests have a sensitivity and specificity, so they all require, some reasoning. Tommy has this nice saying that the models still require. The model output still requires cortical input, right? You still have to use your brain.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is I'm not trying to replace practitioners with a robot. I'm trying to augment them and allow them to do more with less testing.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost digitization of the testing in some ways, like making it into a software as opposed to a pure hardware measurement.
Right. Yeah, I wonder about that, whether some of these labs they're going to start testing less stuff directly and doing more tests, in silicon, you could say it.
Right.
In silico is a thing in biology, right? We're going to do this experiment in silico. And some of the things, they don't get it though. When I talk to these lab companies, I interview them for my podcast, and there's one person in particular that I won't name, and they were talking about a new feature they just added onto the hormone panel that looked at something called the cortisol awakening response. So when you wake up in the morning, there's this sudden surge of cortisol, and that's what gets you going. And if you don't have it, then it's a sign that your autonomic nervous system's not doing very well. It doesn't handle stress very well. Like you wouldn't. So if you can't
Like if you have cortisol fatigue, probably.
Well, if you can't mount a decent cortisol response first thing in the morning when you wake up, then you're probably not going to mount it at any other time either, right? So, you know, if a mountain lion was to jump out behind that rock, you should get a pretty good, but you know, it would take minutes for cortisol to get going. Actually, the first thing that would happen is adrenaline. But yeah, you should get a pretty good cortisol response from that. And so these people don't. And they just don't enjoy. I mean, that for me. So I think I was depressed. That's kind of the definition of depression: is you don't enjoy something you used to previously enjoy because you need a bit of adrenaline and cortisol to get going and enjoy it. Right? When you do one of your triathlons, it's the same. You've got to have cortisol to mobilize that energy so that you can do it and have fun. And if you can't mobilize energy and do it and have fun, then yeah, it's not fun. But anyway, so he had this cortisol awakening response that he just recently bolted onto this hormone panel, and it's interesting for sure. But you know, given my previous experience doing data science projects, I knew almost with certainty that I'd be able to predict that from what he was already measuring, right? So you're already measuring this cortisol several times throughout the day. You're asking me just to like predict the shape of this curve. Like I can almost guarantee I can do that with like, you know, maybe
enough data.
Yeah. Like, and I'm sure enough data has like been one of those things I've learned about in data science. You think you need 2 million label examples before you can do anything interesting. That's not true. If you look at Pima Indians, there's a public data set, and somebody has created a model, and I think the accuracy is 80-something%, using 768 data points. And there's only like 5 features in the data. So, you know, I think sometimes big data is a myth. You know, you think you need 2 million label examples. No, sometimes 700 is enough.
That's something we see a lot in the investment world, is that that simple models actually outperform all kinds of things.
Right.
Like, number one, they outperform the human experts almost always.
Right.
Like there was a really interesting meta study that was done by Grove and then also this guy Paul Meal, both professors, and they studied all these different domains. And I think it was like, I want to say it was like 120 different studies where they pitted a simple model against a human expert. And it turned out that 40% of the cases, the model just trounced the expert. 40% it was a draw. And then, actually it was even worse than that. But it was only like 5 of the cases in the cross section that the model underperformed the expert. Right. And then they looked at those and they saw that, you know, there was probably some things missing from the model that they could have put in that would have solved that. So yeah, like the human doesn't do very well against the expert. And I mean, this was everything from judging wine to recidivism rates to, you know, doctors testing. They had one test that was especially scary. Was they gave doctors this very simple scan of, I don't want to say it was like maybe like kidney disease or something like that. And what the doctors didn't know is that they had actually duplicated each one and shuffled them into it. So each one had 2, like was a duplicate.
And so they classified the same image differently.
They got themselves, they had contradicted themselves to a scary degree.
And that's the thing that humans, so that's what I figured out, you know, I mean, I think most people know this intuitively, is that humans are really good at recognizing patterns in images, but when you give them structured data, so numbers in a spreadsheet, they really don't do well on that. So I don't, you know, I talked about trying to automate what Tommy does. Well, Tommy can't do that. He can't look at a blood chemistry with 38 markers on it and say, oh, well, this person's got a C. diff infection. And actually, I don't have a model to do that either. But let's take a different example, right? Let's say this person has mercury toxicity. Well, I've got a model that's got sensitivity and specificity in the 90s that can tell you whether or not there's elevated blood levels of mercury. And there's no safe level of blood levels of mercury. Like, there shouldn't be any there whatsoever. And Tommy can't do that. He can't look at your blood chemistry. He can tell you a lot of stuff by looking at your basic blood chemistry. In fact, a surprising amount. And the humble blood chemistry, which is available in every country, you know, every corner of the globe, anyone can get one almost. And he can tell you a lot just from that, but he can't tell you whether you've got mercury toxicity. And so we're doing something, and I think that's wise, because yeah, sure, I can look at a CT scan of a lung and tell you whether or not this is a malignant tumor, because humans are really good at recognizing patterns in images.
Yeah.
But they're not really good at looking at a spreadsheet and seeing a pattern inside of a bunch of floating point numbers, right?
Right.
So, not the same type.
How far away do you think we are from like a Star Trek, like tricorder, you know, they just like scan, maybe take some blood sample, and then it can give you like a diagnosis within 2 seconds, you know, that kind of a...
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be... Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a good question. We've always joked about that. So like most of the samples that we collect go into the, like normally go down the toilet, right? So when are we going to have a toilet that collects my pee and then tells me how well my Krebs cycle is working? Like you can do that. You can measure all the Krebs cycle intermediaries. So the Krebs cycle is this important biochemical pathway that happens inside of the mitochondria of each and every cell, and so if you don't have that working properly, I mean, that's almost the definition of death, right? So yeah, can I take a pee and then I get, you know, a message on my phone saying, oh, you're deficient in carnitine right now, you should probably eat some red meat. Like that would be super cool.
Yeah,
but
a smart toilet.
I think like maybe it's mass spec that's holding it back, like the cost of mass spec. It's really, you know, it makes the supplements really expensive. So we use new supplements, especially from Thorne Research, to fix a lot of the problems we find on tests. And yeah, they're really expensive supplements, and the reason they're really expensive is because they get their raw materials from the best possible sources, and then they put them in quarantine until they do mass spec on them to make sure that what the company that supplied them said was in them is really in them.
Yeah.
And then they do that mass spec 2 more times as the product passes through the production line. And you end up with a supplement that costs a minimum of $60, right? So
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, maybe that's what's holding this all back, is like the cost of mass spec.
Is that the choke point of the system?
Yeah,
you think?
Yeah, maybe it is. I love things that you can do anyway and get really great results without them costing any money. So Tommy just did a podcast with Greg Potter, who just successfully defended his PhD in, I believe it's chronobiology is the field. So he's an expert in circadian rhythm. And they talked about some of his research and the things that you can do to entrain your circadian rhythm so that you get better sleep and a healthier metabolism. And I love that stuff because anybody can do it. It doesn't cost anything. It has some profound effects on health. It's just all good stuff, you know?
Right.
And so you know, you don't really need better mass spec in order to do that, right? Like, yeah, we need better buildings. So part of the problem there is that people are designing buildings that make it almost impossible to appropriately entrain your circadian rhythm, right? So light is the major cue. And so everybody has buildings that are too dim inside during the day. So probably only 500 lux of light when you're inside during the day. And then, you know, it's at least 100 times brighter than that when you go outside, even if it's cloudy outside. So we need better buildings.
Is it that bad? It's 100?
Yeah,
Wow.
It's really bad. You don't notice it because your pupils,
yeah,
right?
of course.
Your pupils dilate.
Correcting for it.
You don't notice it. But yeah, if you get a light meter and measure it, yeah, I think it's at least 10,000 lux outside. So yeah, you know, there are researchers like Sachin Panda is one of them that's working with people to make better buildings so that people don't have these problems with their metabolism and sleep. So I think you know, probably I'd be more excited about that than I would be about, like, you know, putting a drop of blood on a little thing that tells me, you know, how I'm doing today.
Yeah. I mean, the other nice thing about those interventions are that, you know, when you measure any kind of a medical efficacy, you have to look at the upside, what happens percentage-wise and magnitude, and also downside. Right. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's an interesting point, isn't it? It's the oath that all the doctors take is first do no harm. Well, that doesn't really work, right? Because with most, there's always a downside. So take, for example, you know, C. diff is a good example, actually, where the thing that's causing it to bloom and overgrow is the overuse of broad spectrum antibiotics. And so you could say, well, just don't do the antibiotics, but the person might die, right? So now you have to weigh up the probabilities. So I could either not use antibiotics and this person dies, or I could use them and then they end up with a C. diff overgrowth.
Right.
Which may also be fatal, but it might not.
Not right away.
Yeah, so yeah, you're always, you know, thinking probabilistically is an important skill to have because, you know, we're always thinking in probabilities, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes the the measurement period of those things. So like let's say it doesn't kill you right away, but 30 years of doing this and
Right.
it's a dramatic problem.
Right.
Like I wonder that about a lot of like environmental, plastics, things like that. And,
Yeah.
how much
Oh,
do we even have data sets
Oh, yeah, we do, for
long
some
enough
things.
though to truly capture the
Yeah, so I can actually send you data. So, we used to put lead in gasoline to
Right.
improve the octane rating, and that's said to have killed, like, I can't remember the exact numbers, and I won't quote them here because I'll be shooting from the hip. But it's a lot. It was really serious. Like putting lead in gasoline was a complete disaster for cardiovascular disease, and the reason is lead is toxic to the endothelial cells that line the arteries. And so, terrible mistake. And it's still in a lot of things, paint, obviously. It's in children's toys. It's in garden hoses. Don't ever drink out of a garden hose because sometimes they have lead in them. All this stuff. I grew up racing two-stroke go-karts and riding two-stroke motorbikes and handling lead solder. When I did an apprenticeship as an electronics engineer, we used lead solder. And I was thinking about this recently, I don't think, there's a vapor that comes off solder, and I don't think there's lead in that. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can vaporize metal like that and breathe it in, but I think that's the flux in the center of the solder. But I'm obviously handling it all day long, and at that point, as an 18-year-old kid, I didn't give a shit about anything like that. I just probably be eating a sandwich whilst soldering something together. But you're right. So environmental pollutants, you introduce this thing assuming it has no effect on biology, and then 30 years later, oh whoops. And of course the latest thing that I think this is going to happen with is non-native EMF, right? So we're putting in Wi-Fi routers everywhere. The level of background noise is now like hundreds of millions times more than what it was, and it has to have an effect on human biology. And so we're probably going to find out in 50 years, oh whoops. So then you could argue for, should there be a precautionary principle, right? Like, should we not do this just in case we find out later? And that seems like a wise strategy to me.
Yeah, how do you balance that against what seems like progress in a lot of other ways?
Yeah,
that's
get
that
accused
same
of being a
upside
Luddite.
versus downside.
Or you could just move away and live in Bonnie Doon, just hide from all of it, right? We're really lucky here that we don't. I used to live in London, and you'd look for a Wi-Fi signal and there'd be 50 to choose from. And,
right.
The street lights outside, right, like literally a street light outside my bedroom window, and buses and fire engines. We were just around the corner from a hospital, so we get a lot of ambulances with the sirens going. And so it was really hard to have a good night's sleep. Whereas now I live in Bonnie Doon, and there's no street lights. There's the only Wi-Fi signal's mine, pretty much. So maybe that's the answer. We should all just go and live in the woods.
Yeah.
But of course, with that comes another problem. Again, it's that back to you're almost trying to balance the things. Like I came here thinking that, and then maybe more recently I learned about the problems associated with social isolation. So, oh my God. I mean, Brian Walsh is one of the researchers that was instrumental in the creation of the blood chemistry calculator, but he's also another really deep critical thinker, and he was the first person to bring this to our attention. And that includes Tommy, had not really thought about it too much before Brian. But there's a whole body of literature and some really good books, actually. There's one book called Loneliness, and I can't remember the name of the author, but there's a whole body of literature that shows that being lonely is a huge risk factor. And in fact, in some papers, it looks like it's epidemiology, so you can't really know cause, but you can't know cause, not really. You can't know cause, but it looks as dangerous as smoking. Like being lonely is as dangerous as smoking. So you move out to Bonnie Doon and you get rid of the Wi-Fi and you get rid of the light pollution, but now you're lonely, and so that you might as well start, live in the city and start smoking. It's the same risk. It's crazy.
Because what would have been a death sentence for an ancestral health environment? It would have been being cast out by yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So, I wouldn't be surprised if there was almost some shutdown mechanism or something that...
Well, this is why people behave in weird ways, right? Like they try and rationalize strange behavior. And I can't remember what book I was reading this in recently, where they talked about an experiment that was done where somehow they had this ability to manipulate people's brain, and it was because they had something wrong with them, like they were able to put something in there and control this part of the brain. Oh, that's right, the parts of the brain were disconnected.
The medial...
I can't remember the exact name. They've got really fancy names for all these different parts of the brain. They keep changing them. But so they would press a button and someone would stand up and go get a drink of water, And they knew that there was no way that person either initiated that or knew why they were doing it. But when you ask them, well, why did you just go and do that? And they'll rationalize it, right? Or why would you rationalize it? Because if you seem like a crazy person amongst your peers, and you get cast out into the woods, you're dead. Like, you can't survive by yourself. So
yeah, that's the whole, I mean, there's a very strong survival mechanism built into our commitment consistency bias.
Right. Yeah, and so, that was, Brian came on my podcast and talked about some research that had been done where they'd looked at changes in the immune system when people are lonely. So this, again, kind of makes sense. Like, imagine you're part of a tribe, then you want to gear up your immune system towards communicable diseases, right? You don't want to get, something that you can pass when someone coughs on you. Whereas if you're alone in the woods, then that switches the immune system more over to the innate immune system, right? So if I was to slip and cut myself on this rock, that's a different type of immunities from communicable diseases, right? It's acquired versus innate immunity. And so, I mean, that's, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is that it's like a pro-inflammatory state. So if you're lonely and your innate immune system is switched on all the time, that's kind of it's kind of like investing in defense at the expense of education and hospitals and stuff like that, right? So you're kind of burning through your resources quickly at the expense of the long term, and that's not good. But that's what people do, right? Like, so many people are lonely today, including me a little bit in Bonnytoon. Getting the dog was like really helpful. Getting the dog got me out of the. It's like MBT has been all about this, like me solving my own problems, and they're like, I wonder if anyone else has had this problem, and that's. I've not done very well at persuading other people to get a dog. I'd never owned a dog. I'd never lived with a dog, didn't know anything about dogs. But I realised that, so there's some people might argue that the dog could be a companion in itself, and that might be true to a certain extent. But for me, the dog was a tool to get me out of the house and to meet the neighbours. And that was another thing I learned.
Dog as a social lubricant.
Exactly. That's how Simon describes himself, actually, with the behaviour change thing. It's like, I can't make it change for you, but I can act as a lubricant that will make it happen more easily. But yeah, the dog has been great for getting me out of the house and meeting people. Not always for the good, like some people are not that stoked about your off-leash dog or it being somewhere where it shouldn't be, on the beach, for example. But for the most part, it's been really good. And yeah, one of the things I learned along the way is that people always worry that they don't have enough. So the stuff that we do, the paleo movement, primal, whatever you want to call it, there's these tribe of people, and it's kind of isolating, right? Like, kind of, you get separated from normal people because they're doing making different choices in almost everything they do.
Especially if you were early on in this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so people worry, I don't have any friends anymore because I'm doing all this stuff. I only know these 3 people I met at a conference last year, and that's it. All my other friends I don't really talk to anymore. And that's a huge exaggeration. But as it turns out, I think that the loneliness problem is not as hard to solve as I originally thought, because the depth of the relationship doesn't really matter that much. It's the frequency that's important. So, just saying hello to your neighbour. Like, one of the things, we manage people, their health projects, with a Kanban board, the agile system with a to-do, doing a review and done. And, one of the cards I put in the to-do column is be the first person to say hello. Anyone can do that.
Yeah, go first.
And, just even that, how's your father? How's the weather? That's enough. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it. You probably would have lived in a tribe, 30, 40 people or something. And so you would have had lots of frequent interactions with these people and not necessarily a super deep relationship with all of them. So that's kind of encouraging. I was quite pleased. I was that's one of the things so it's been 5 years since we started MBT, and every year I seem to find this whole new dimension of stuff. Oh no, I thought it was just food. I thought I had this all figured out.
It's only food. It's only sleep. It's only exercise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's all these. But yeah.
Well, really, it's the human experience that you're chasing at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm in a way, it keeps life interesting, really, doesn't it? With a podcast, I didn't really plan it this way, but I called it the Nourish Balance Thrive podcast for want of a better name. And Nourish Balance Thrive was just the name that Julie's mum came up with. And I thought it was...
No real thought into it. It was just
not really, but it kind of worked, because we started with food, which was the nourish bit, and then we did this testing, which was balancing, and then it ends up with you thriving. And I can't say that I really say that to anyone ever, but those words, they gave me license to talk about literally anything on the podcast. And I was so happy that when I realised that, you see someone else start a podcast and it's the the keto I don't want to like make,
Yeah.
the keto evangelist is such a terrible name for a podcast because, you paint yourself into a corner after about 15 minutes.
Right. Have you found that the podcast for you has become like this kind of serendipity machine?
Yeah.
Where it just creates these opportunities where like, well, I wouldn't have done that otherwise, or
Right.
talk to that person, or.
It was the smartest thing I ever did. I really think that. And the main reason I started it was because I couldn't write. And I probably could learn to write if I really tried, but I don't really have much interest in writing. And so the podcast was something I could do easily. We could just literally pick up a mic and start talking. And I think that's and I'd really cringe if I listened to the first episode now. I've been doing it since the start. So I think I've done like probably close to 300 episodes at one a week now. So yeah, we just start talking, and with the guests, that's exactly right. So you bump into someone interesting, you get them on the podcast. In fact, actually how it started was I went to the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2014. That was when it really got going, actually, was I met these people that were giving talks. And I didn't realise at the time, but academics will gladly talk about their work. Like they'll be really happy to have that opportunity to talk about their research. And so those people, it was really easy to get them on the podcast, and they were great, and really useful information.
Yeah.
And you'd be able to integrate that into your coaching business, almost immediately, because they distill it down for you. Like
right.
Sometimes you get an academic.
They've been lecturing for probably a long time, so they have a pretty good rap usually at that point.
Yeah, and it's that distillation process. You have someone that does 4 decades of experiments, and yet they can come on your podcast and summarize that work in less than an hour. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So that was really powerful. And then of course you've got a friend. You can talk to ask the person a question later on. And that's been the best to build the Rolodex was like probably the best reason to start the podcast. And I think you can communicate with people in a way that you can't in writing as well. Like, so even if I spent the rest of my life learning to be a better writer, I think I probably still couldn't connect with people. I get people on the phone, and they'll have been listening to the podcast for a whole year maybe before they come forward to work as a client, and then you'll talk to them and they'll be like, oh, I feel like I already know you because I've been listening to the podcast. Yeah,
that is a weird phenomena, isn't it? Where it's like you've heard that person's voice for so long that you do feel like you know them already.
Yeah, and it just doesn't come across in words at all. I think maybe there's some writers that can do that. I don't know, but probably not many that can really convey their personality in words.
Yeah, have a real voice.
Yeah, I sometimes think that about some of the authors, but of course I only listen to audiobooks now. Simon always makes fun of me because I don't read anything. I always listen to everything, and I read like papers from PubMed. I mean, you can't listen to those, but everything else I listen to. And I feel like I know Nicholas Nassim Taleb because I've been listening to Inserto almost endlessly because I just love that. But I think it's partly, I've forgotten the name of the narrator for, I think Anti-Fragile was one that, and then what was the other one? I think it's the same guy that does the narration, and he does it really well.
Is he good? I haven't listened to him.
Oh, really?
I've read him, but I haven't listened to him.
Yeah, I think he really captures Taleb's voice.
What's your favorite of Taleb's books?
What am I listening to now? Oh, Skin in the Game was the one that I just
listened to. The most recent one.
Yeah, the most recent one. Yeah, I don't know. They kind of like they overlap quite a bit, don't you think? Like he talks, like he uses even like the same the green lumber thing. I love that. Like not understanding the difference between freshly cut wood, which is green lumber, and wood that's been painted green, which is green lumber. Like I like that appears definitely in more than one book. So they kind of overlap in that way. But yeah, I love that the idea of skin in the game. It definitely ruffled a few feathers inside of we use Slack to communicate. It's just like this constant like banter that's going on I think the traditionally trained academics that like really get their feathers ruffled by Taleb because it just like the intellectual yet idiot thing just comes just a little bit too close to home.
Yeah, for sure.
But all of my guys deadlift, so they can't possibly be intellectuals yet idiots, There
you go. Yeah. Well, Taleb would approve of that, wouldn't he?
Exactly. But yeah, I love that. Some of the guys, they make fun of his diction, as they call it. Like he deliberately chooses words like ergodicity is like one of the words.
That
like
one's very popular.
Like you search for ergodicity. Tommy did this the other day, and it immediately suggests Taleb, which means what he didn't invent that word. Like it's been there a long time. We do see it in papers sometimes, but
he popularized it.
It, which is kind of douchebaggish. But I do enjoy that idea of skin in the game.
Yeah, no, he's been responsible for ahas for me, mental models that are like even just the idea like Anti-Fragile when you think
Yeah.
about a spectrum of where things can fall. And you always think like, oh yeah, robust and
Right, what's the
fragile.
opposite of robust?
But there was like a whole other half of the spectrum that I never
everyone
even,
ignored.
Yeah, never even realized.
And of course, this is so relevant to what we do because, I mean, we've spent the last 100 years trying to remove every last single stressor from our life, right? And what has that done for us? Well, it's created type 2 diabetes. It's created an epic of type 2 diabetes. And then you actually do see that. I can send you a paper that shows there's a link between the use of air conditioning and heating and type 2 diabetes. So, you know, back in the day, in the winter you got cold and in the summer you got really hot, and we have adaptations to cope with that.
Yeah.
So for example, brown fat is a way for us to uncouple. So rather than making ATP out of energy, you just uncouple and you just release the as heat. And no one does that anymore. Why would you need brown fat? You just put the heat on, right?
Right.
So yeah, the removal of these little stressors has made us fragile.
Soft,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, soft, exactly. That's a better way of putting it. So yeah, very relevant to what we do. But of course you can have too much of these stressors, which is probably what we see more of in our athletes. You know, they do.
Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, after the Keto Summit in 2016, we had a ton of athletes that were coming to us and saying, oh, well, I did great on that keto diet in the beginning and I lost a lot of weight. And then I did my second Ironman and just the wheels came off the wagon and I've never been the same since. And, you know, it kind of makes sense when you think about it. I think of ketosis, so this ability to exist without fuel. It's like a sort of special power-up mode that humans have, but you can't do it forever, right? Like you only get so many presses of that button before things start to go wrong. So yeah, we definitely see more. We spend a lot of time telling athletes to eat more food, especially the endurance athletes where body weight is part of what that makes them competitive, right? So if you're doing, like mountain biking is one of them actually, it's like mostly won and lost on the climbs.
Which
and so
is
if you can be,
which is
power
to weight ratio,
power to weight ratio. So if you can produce the same power and be, 3 kilos lighter, that's going to make a huge difference to your performance. Yeah, I talked to, Paul Latoya. I don't think I've introduced you to him, but he's done unschooling, I would guess I would call it, rather than homeschooling. When you say homeschooling, people conjure up ideas of recreating the classroom at home. But he's been doing that, I think, for pretty much a whole time for his boys that are similar age to yours. And he comes up with all kinds of really cool projects for them to do.
Really?
Like, yeah, I quite like to do that. Like usually something that involves image processing, like some sort of device that's going to automatically feed the chickens or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
I was thinking I could do one.
It's like Doc Brown,
Oh, I've never heard that.
Oh, from Back to the Future.
Oh, Doc Brown, of course.
Yeah, just all kinds of like Rube Goldberg machines to do different things that you.
Yeah, I quite like to make an image classifier. So I'd have a video on the feeders that would identify when there's a squirrel there. And it would so it didn't just go off when there was a bird there, but when it was a squirrel. And I know exactly how to do that. It's quite easy to do with a convolutional deep neural network and a Raspberry Pi board.
Yeah.
And then I bet I could even do it so that it could identify what type. So we've got two types of squirrel here: the native Western grey, and then the invasive non-Eastern grey.
What's your philosophy for parenting?
Oh,
if you have one.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that I'm almost entirely dependent on my wife for this type of thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, you could argue that's been true for the outset. Like, actually, all of my stuff is like, just standing on the shoulders of giants here. But yeah, certainly with the parenting strategies, Julie knew exactly what she wanted to do. Incredibly. See, one of my buddies that I ride bikes with, he teaches critical thinking at a local community college, and he pointed out that Julie's very unusual in that she has very strong maternalistic instincts, and at the same time, she's an intellectual, right? So
yeah.
You don't normally get both in the same person. I thought, that's a really good observation that I hadn't made.
About my wife.
Yeah, about my wife. Yeah. So yeah, she grew up knowing all of her brothers as babies. She was there for the birth of all of them. And Cal is only 11, so he's almost like a brother to Ivy, who's 4.
Yeah.
And, you know, she just knew what to do, you know, like I think most new parents, like, didn't you go through a time like that? You're like trying to figure out what to do? Like, what does this cry mean? Is this like a bad cry or is this an okay cry? And how does this diaper go on? And where should they sleep? And like Julie already knew exactly what to do with all of that stuff because presumably she'd seen her mum make a bunch of mistakes. And the same is true with the schooling, you know, it just doesn't make any sense, does it? Like to sit children down and, you know, like we were talking about yesterday, Josh wrote about, our neurologist friend wrote about how you don't need to force children to do something they don't want to do because their brains have evolved to pick the thing which is going to be best for them at that time and
code that as fun.
Yeah, it's coded as fun. That's a perfect way of saying it. So if the kid doesn't find it's fun, it's probably not going to be good for them at this time. But nobody thinks like that, right? Like the harder, the more horrible it is, then the better.
Yeah, it's almost like we're trying to overclock the kids.
Yeah.
Like push them to a level of difficulty where maybe they would have gotten there in a year.
Right.
And been happy all the way along the whole process.
Right. And I've done that already. You know, Ivy, as you know, loves her books. And, you know, we call it like the book bitch thing, you know, where she starts throwing books at you.
Oh, yeah.
Book bitch. And like, why don't you just learn to read? Like, wouldn't that solve a lot of problems if you could read? And so it's been tempting for me to, like, you know, try and force that a little bit. But Josh told me, just don't, you know, I'll tell you which books, I'll tell you how to do it if that's what you really want to do. But trust me, you're making a mistake. She'll learn when she's ready and not a moment sooner. And so that's the philosophy. Unschooling is probably the best word that captures that, I think. But yeah, we'll see how that works out. Obviously, she's only 4, so probably if you interview me in 2 years' time, I probably said, oh yeah, we caved on that after about 6 months, and now she's in...
Now she's in cello practice.
Yeah. I just seems like a lot of bad stuff happens when they go to school, right? So the posterior chain goes to sleep from sitting on these tiny little chairs. And so then you're destined to have a life of back problems, right? We know that most people get back problems at some point in their life. And then they bathe you in all the non-native EMF because everything has to be tablets and computers now and Wi-Fi routers and all of that. And you're in artificial light all day long, right? So we talked about how, okay, now you're only seeing 500 lux of light all day long and you're not sleeping very well at night. Oh, and the food is all toxic, right? Like super toxic, the worst food possible, imaginable. And what comes out of it? Oh, well, you learn how to do arithmetic and multiplication. Well, I think I can do that with, I don't even need a calculator anymore. I can do that in a web browser toolbar, what you're learning.
So it might be a little behind the curve.
Yeah, it's just...
It's for an industrial era.
Exactly. So, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk. He has the most watched TED Talk of all time.
Yeah, on creativity and kids.
Exactly. It's just... and I think lots of people have written about this, haven't they? That it's just... School is just a thing invented for another time.
There was a really good... something I picked up, and I think it was from... Josh Waitzkin from when Tim Ferriss interviewed him.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how, I'm pretty sure this was the right one, I might be misattributing it, but he said that his son, whenever it would rain outside, they would go and play in the rain. And he deliberately avoided saying words like that it was bad weather.
Oh yeah, that's
and
clever.
The whole idea was that it was like you're creating this framework in their heads that
right.
Oh, like this is good, this is bad.
Yeah, this learned association.
I don't have control over anything
because
it's bad, and it's like it's a very interesting.
Yeah,
idea.
And I feel like that's probably the default state, you know, and then like the bad stuff happens. So for example, another example is Ivy doesn't know strangers. She literally doesn't know what a stranger is, and she'll come up and, you know, start snuggling someone in an airport, literally. I've seen her do it the other day.
So I shouldn't feel that special that she was giving me.
Damn. And I think that's probably just what baby humans are like, aren't they? And then, like, one day they realise that that's not appropriate, or someone like does something mean, and then I don't know. I feel like that's probably the natural state, and then something else is learned. But yeah, that's really powerful, isn't it? Just general advice that, you know, there's no such thing as good or bad, only your response to it, right?
Yeah. I've tried, I would say, very unsuccessfully probably, to just incorporate a little bit of some Buddhist principles into some of the things I talk to the kids about.
Right.
It's really tough. I mean, I think you're swimming against a pretty big cultural stream.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I really enjoyed. So, actually, that was Josh's recommendation. Why Buddhism is True, by Robert Wright. It was a fantastic book.
Yeah, that was a great one. It came along for me at a perfect time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens. Yeah, Simon's been an endless source of good book recommendations. Everybody gets carried away in the moment, and there's definitely, like, if Ivy kicks me in the balls, then I don't have a moment to contemplate whether or not I'm gonna like whack her back. You know, it just happens, like, and then I'm like, oh God, what just happened?
That quote from Viktor Frankl about your power lies
Yeah,
within
exactly.
the gap between stimulus and response.
It's a fantastic quote, but I still think that there isn't a gap. If somebody kicks you in the nuts, then there is no gap.
That's a very short gap.
I mean, so meditation, I felt like in the beginning it was like an important skill to learn, you know, like just noticing that actually your mind is either in the past or in the future most of the time.
Yeah.
And almost never in the present. And then, like, you know, I did Headspace for quite a long time, and then you get to the point you're like, I get it, you know, and then you start to notice that there is that gap, like most of the time, apart from when someone pokes you in the eye with a fork. There is a gap between the stimulus and the response, and you don't need to keep meditating in order to, do you know what I mean? It's like anything, you get good at it and you don't need to keep.
I don't know, I'm not sure.
Maybe I'm just an anomaly there. I mean, the same with kiteboarding. You know, I hadn't kiteboarded for 7 years, and I went back to the beach, and it was like I'd never stopped. Like literally, I wouldn't have. You know.
Guess you have good. Your neurons stay well myelinated.
They're like totally on plastic.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like if I go without meditating for a while, and I'm kind of actually on one of those streaks right now as a bit of a test. I feel like I'm shorter with the kids, with everybody.
Yeah.
It's tough though. I mean, if you tried to do everything, every routine that you knew was probably good for you, and like,
I'll be a full-time job.
it's a full-time job.
Yeah,
it's
I
like
know.
there's no time to work.
So this is why the Habit of the Doohickey book is like almost the most important book, because if you can just put these things on autopilot, like I don't deplete willpower thinking about what I'm going to eat in the morning. You know, I don't have to look, you know, I don't open my fridge and I see 10 things that I know I can't eat, and then 10 things that I know that I can. There's just nothing in my fridge I can't eat. And then the same with our lighting. Like, it's pretty much impossible to create light at night in our house. Actually, that's not true. There are a couple of lights you can switch on, but for the most part, you know, we have these low power incandescent lights that are on a dimmer. And so, you know, it's not like I'm making this conscious decision not to turn the lights on every night. It's just on autopilot, you know?
Yeah. Now, I agree with the willpower part, but what about just sheer time volume? Like, like I think about, like, if I was designing like my perfect day, there'd be meditation, there'd probably be like a Wim Hof session, there'd be some cold plunging, some heat, some weightlifting.
Yeah, that's true. You can definitely make a full-time job.
All of a sudden, it's like 2 p.m. and I haven't done anything productive for the rest of the world yet. Like, how do you survive in that?
Yeah, it's true. I probably spend more time doing that kind of stuff than I care to admit.
Oh, me too. I mean,
I walk the dog 3 times a day. I ride my bike an hour and a half every day. I go sauna every day. I lift weights. But I mean, the weights I don't go to the gym anymore and like do a session. It's all like, oh look, that's why the kettlebells are like
just sitting there,
just
different
sitting there,
places.
Yeah. And my wife always complains. Julie always complains. Oh, I'm sick of tripping over these things. I'm like, that's exactly what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, you're supposed to trip over it and then pick it up.
Yeah.
Do a couple and then go do something else.
Yeah.
The toughest things to figure out at this stage of life is that achievement versus fulfillment balance, because it's very easy to feel pretty fulfilled and you know, taking care of all the things that you want to do with your health, and you know, walk the dog 3 times, but then all right, well, I'm not getting as much done as I know I could, and like, the business isn't doing what I know it could.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to fall into. I've always been like this, that money. It's actually Tim O'Reilly said, I think it's on Tim Ferriss's podcast as well, but I've known Tim O'Reilly since time immemorial, because O'Reilly Media made those computer science books that have an animal on the cover. Like, if you've ever known a programmer, they had at least one of those books. And I'm not sure I have a paper one anymore, but they were a huge part of my education. And he said, it's like gas on a road trip. You don't want to run out, but you're not doing a tour of gas stations, right? It's like, I've almost taken that philosophy. So yeah, I mean, I realise that, I mean, especially living where we do in the Bay Area, where you can't buy a house for less than $1 million, and property, you know, if you bought one in the last 5 years, then your property tax is probably enough to pay somebody's salary in the Midwest, you know?
Right.
And so, yeah, we've made some difficult choices. We made it a bit hard for ourselves.
Yeah,
because we don't really have, it's not like we're seeing clients in Santa Cruz, like we could go anywhere.
Right, yeah, choosing this location as to set your kind of run rate.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's lovely. I mean, as you know, it's lovely here. The mountain biking's world class. Yeah, I think Julie's parents would kill me if I was to take the kids away, right? That's like a really mean thing to do. Just so that you can save a few quid on the mortgage.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, you didn't have a whole lot of choice on that one.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to test that one. What would happen? I don't know. I just would feel really bad about it as well, because Julie's parents are quite young. There's not really a whole generation gap between me and them. I'm 42.
It's a half.
Yeah, they're 10 years older than me. And so they're full of life, they're energetic, they're very motivated and present, unlike, I don't know, some older parents I've seen that just like,
yeah, they're already
not really into it. They're like past all that. I mean, that's what motivates me now is, you know, it used to be about performance. Can I get 1% faster? Can I put another half point on my hemoglobin so that I can win this next bike race? Whereas now, you know, I look at the energy that Julie's parents have when they play with Ivy, and I mean, not Bauer, not yet, but I'm sure they will. Right? You know, can I achieve that? Will I have that much energy like them when even if I make it that far as a Grand Prix? 'Cause I'm 42 now.
Different optimization.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you still know what success looks like. If I can get off the floor without using my hands whilst holding a child, then
Turkish get up with a kid.
Yeah,
you can. Everything's okay. Do you have like big longevity aspirations? Is that something that's important to you?
No, definitely. I mean, I don't think anybody with I don't know. I feel like everybody wants health span, right? They want more quality years, not necessarily more years. I mean, my worst nightmare is, you know, getting cancer or something, and then somebody spending $600,000 or even $1 million on the last 6 months of your life on healthcare.
Yeah, and it's just managing this downward spiral.
Yeah, that maybe, you know, added 30 days onto your life or something. Well, that was definitely different.
Yeah, a little different than.
I don't know. What did you think?
I think it's good.
It's definitely fun.
Hey, it's Jake here again. I hope you enjoyed this hike with Chris Kelly as much as I did. If you like this Hikecast format, or maybe even want to take me on your favorite hike, shoot me an email at 5goodquestions@gmail.com, all spelled out. Lastly, be on the lookout for my first literary effort, The Rebel Allocator, coming out later this year. Hopefully I'll see you on the trail soon.